On behalf of the Institute of the International Law of Peace and Armed Conflict and the Network on Humanitarian Action, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second in our set of 3 online conversations with former Commissioner of DG ECHO, Christos Stylianides. My name is Will Wright, and I'm a research associate at the IFHV, as well as the communications and administrative manager of the NOHA network, and I will be your host this evening. For those of you who missed our conversation last week on education and emergencies and want to go back and watch it, it will be posted online soon on NOHA's YouTube channel. And it was really fascinating from my perspective, and I'm very happy to get the opportunity to speak with our guest again tonight. So before we get started, I'd take the opportunity to introduce Commissioner Stylianides again. As mentioned earlier, he served as the European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management from 2014 until 2019, and was also appointed by the European Council as the EU Ebola Coordinator in 2014. He's received a number of awards for his work in politics and humanitarian action, but if anyone is looking for some extra incentive to revisit last week's conversation, he was awarded the Global Champion for Education and Emergencies by the Education Cannot Wait, and the Political Champion for Education and Emergencies by the Malala Foundation. At the moment, he has a number of different roles. He was recently named as the EU Special Envoy for the promotion of freedom of religion and belief outside the EU. And he is a visiting professor in practice at the Department of Health Policy of the London School of Economics, a faculty member at the University of Nicosia Medical School, and visiting international professor at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum. So thank you very much for being here today, Commissioner.
Thanks once again, my dear friend Will, Mr. Wright, and thanks a lot also the student for being here in our today debate, which is completely something very interesting and exciting to me. First of all, because your modern ownership is beyond imagination, is close to excellent. This is what I had as experience last time. And thanks once again for your kind words about me. But as I said a week ago, always the speakers and all panelists, they have the privilege to hear some kind words about them, little bit beyond of the reality. Okay, I'm ready to start this discussion, and definitely we can enjoy all together as a team this very really challenging thing about humanitarian and development aid nexus.
Fantastic. So for those who weren't here last time, we'll structure this a little bit like an interview with a series of questions that I'll ask. And then that will take us to hopefully around 6:45, 7 o'clock. And then we can open up for some audience questions, but we'll try to we'll wrap everything up by latest 7:30. So my first question is, if I think back to the scholarly debate about bridging the gap between humanitarian action and development, there's a tendency to sort of pack these concepts into silos. So I'm wondering, how do you conceptualize these two fields, and what is the difference between development and humanitarian action for you?
First of all, we have to recognize that around 10 years ago, maybe less, this discussion and this debate regarding the nexus between humanitarian aid and development aid will be little bit marginalized, because many people, they believe that there is and there are really clear distinctions between humanitarian aid and development. But from my predecessor, Kristalina Georgieva, and my mandate, at least at the European institutions, and in particular through initiatives of DG ECHO, we try to highlight that we have to act in accordance with the condition of the heart reality. And it's not really wise approach to be really hostage of this approach, to be old-fashioned, which it was more or less approached by Bochum. We realize several times, many times, in many different continents, in many different fields, that there was and there is real overlapping between humanitarian action and development action. So I strongly believe that there is no clear distinction between humanitarian action and development action. And this is why I tried a lot in order to promote this idea about the nexus. Of course, there is a sort of distinction. All of us at the universities, at many departments of the development assistance and so on, they recognize that the humanitarian action was and is for the emergency phase, definitely, of any crisis, and development aid was following this emergency phase. This is, I think we can accept everyone that this is a sort of definition and the distinction between humanitarian action in emergency phase and the development action in the development phase, which could follow the emergency phase of the humanitarian action. But especially in our times, the context has already changed. A lot of fragile and conflict-affected and mainly protracted crises are becoming the norm rather than the exception in many parts of the world. And I would like to highlight three words, especially protracted, conflict-affected, and fragile. So these three characteristics of the crisis are so important to be understandable that this is why we can say that the nexus between humanitarian action and development action is more than necessary. Against this background, ensuring a better coherence and complementarity between the humanitarian development and also peace element, peace component, is something which EU action becomes of paramount importance. So we started discussion for a nexus between humanitarian and development action, but I strongly believe, and through my experience on the ground, a lot of experience in many different regions, that we have to accept also another component, the peace component. So now we can talk about triples. So, and if we take in our consideration that in the current time, the UN estimates that there are 2,035 million people with humanitarian needs in 2021. This is an unprecedented record, and the majority of them definitely related to a conflict of some sort. So, and therefore, the need for integrated responses, taking also the political situation into our account, is more than clear. Otherwise, if we continue to think in this framework about distinctions and about emergency phase and development phase, and without any political impact, especially from the peace component perspective, we risk definitely duplication. I saw on the ground many times. And also we risk this silo thinking, as you said. And I strongly believe that we can overcome all this old-fashioned approach and we can go beyond. And I strongly believe that the humanitarian development peace nexus contributes to the overall objective of strengthening the resilience of state, the resilience of societies, the resilience of communities, and also the resilience of individuals. And I remember many times, especially in Africa, when we experience, not only me, but also my dear colleague at that time in DG DEFCO, Neven Mimica, especially in the Sahel region, that it was inevitable to think together about the humanitarian and development action, and the majority of the times also with the peace component perspective. And this is why, with our good colleagues, Federica Mogherini at that time, we tried a lot in order to be together in many areas and in many conferences, especially at that time in Sahel region, because we focused at that time, because also we faced and we dealt with Ebola epidemic in the 3 affected countries in West Africa.
Okay.
I think, Will, my opinion, my position is very clear. It's not a sort of idealistic approach. It's not something which is a sort of ideological approach. No, it's a very practical approach because of my experience on the ground.
Okay, then if thinking coming from your practical approach, where do you see, because there are still some differences in mandates of what different organizations or different actors are working on, where do you see the responsibility to, bridge this gap in the field? What do humanitarian actors have to do? What do development actors have to do? And peace actors, as you brought into this? And then what can we as humanitarians then do to push development actors to sort of doing their part to bridge this gap?
I think, first of all, we should continue this conversation, this positive discussion, to convince everyone who are engaging in this very challenging field that we need this Nexus approach. And I think we have to accept all this brainstorming and debates and to hear, of course, the opposite approach. And I think through this dialogue, we can see more people to adopt this approach that we need this Nexus, and also with the peace component perspective. This is my first point. My second point, I think also we have to be applied at all levels of this approach. And no doubt that humanitarian and development actors on the ground should cooperate when even drafting their first analysis of the situation on the ground. And of course, they have to continue until the last decision-making process to the decision makers. So this is what we believe, all of us who believe in this Nexus, that we have to go together in all steps, step by step together, regardless if the humanitarian actors in the first emergency phase will be the dominant actors, and regardless if the development actors will be the dominant actors in the development phase, but they have to be together. And then I strongly believe, and this is a political issue, one should consult the other, especially when preparing their annual work programs and operational plans, because we need this preparation and we have to be together in order to see our common annual work programs to have a lot of complementarities, and at the same time, our operation plans to be also complement each other, but at the same time to facilitate each other in many specific aspects of the situation on the ground. So I strongly believe that there is a lot of distance to be covered, no doubt, a lot of space of improvement, but I think the EU services are already taking steps toward that direction. And because I continue my contacts and my discussion with my former colleagues and the current commissioner and so on, the need for an effective response against COVID-19 played a very big role in bringing services closer in a more systematic way. So I think, because I remember from my experience as Ebola coordinator at that time, and this is why after some years we managed to achieve altogether the rescue approach in natural disasters. Now I think through COVID, I can say that the COVID-19 played a really special role in bringing our services closer in a more systematic way.
So yeah, I think that makes sense. But so the one thing I'm curious about is you talk about having conversations with colleagues within the European Commission, and I think that's a good experience to draw upon. But in your experience, do you think that the development actors are really having the same conversation about how to bridge this gap that we are? From your time with the European Commission, was bridging the gap, was the Nexus as important as a topic in DG DevCo or now DG INPA and DG ECHO, as it is in DG ECHO? And do you think the humanitarian community is sort of having this conversation by itself?
My dear friend Will, I think you are a little bit provocative now, but you have the right to be provocative as a moderator. Okay, I can accept your assessment about that the humanitarian community was a little bit more in favor about Nexus instead the development community in the first stage of this discussion. Yes, and this is, I think, we have to recognize this in order to start a very sincere discussion. But at the same time, we have to admit that there is progress on that front, real progress. And I remember when I was Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management, as a follow-up of the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, with collaboration with DG DevCo at that time, and my dear colleagues in RELEX committee, a lot of commissioners under Federica Mogherini auspices. At that time, all together with my initiative and proposal, the Commission selected 6 priority countries with specific emphasis on situation of protracted displacement to test the European Union's approach to operationalizing the Nexus. These countries at that time were Chad, Iraq, Myanmar, Nigeria, Sudan, and Uganda. And following the positive engagement of services at that time, and a very good common approach and common action on the ground, this list now is being expanded very considerably, and guidance is being circulated to services both in Brussels, but also on the ground. So, and also from previous Commission Juncker team, the situation already changed, but I know that now there is stronger engagement by both DG Intra, this is how DG DevCo has been renamed, you know, and now because the name is DG International Partnerships, and also in DG ECHO, but also the two commissioners, our successor, Urpilainen and Lenarcic, they continue and they follow this approach about Nexus. So regardless of a different starting point, I can say that the situation inside the European institution, EU services, and in Brussels or in different delegations on the ground, the situation is getting better and better about this togetherness on the ground, and especially to exercise Nexus between humanitarian and development action in a very difficult conditions. I hope to fulfill your expectations about this little bit provocative question.
Well, I think you did a good job.
Thank you so much.
But, okay, thinking, sort of expanding on that a little bit, development is sort of naturally a political and politicized field in terms of how aid, in comparison to humanitarian action, which is supposed to be based on the principles neutral, not non-political. So how do you think that humanitarians can remain neutral while still trying to bridge this gap, or even trying to, you know, look into the levels of coordination that may be possible through the European Commission, and maybe more difficult in other scenarios?
Look, I completely agree with you that development aid is really naturally more political and more politicized in the field, no doubt, I think. At the same time, through my experience and what I am doing also now, humanitarian aid is and should remain principle. The humanitarian principles are not negotiable. Neutrality, impartiality, independence, and so on. So I think this dilemma sometimes is a little bit artificial. Why? For example, and at times, humanitarian aid affects the development aid. See, for instance, the EU that has suspended its development aid to Ethiopia due to the situation in the Tigray region. This is something which a very positive impact. And I know well from many discussions behind the scene that this is not easy. So the two different, without clear distinction, humanitarian aid and development aid, humanitarian community and development community, they have influenced each other in a very positive way. And what is happening now in Ethiopia, I think it's a good example about the real humanitarian aid as a principle action in the framework of the humanitarian principles. So this is one part of the side, one side of the coin. However, donors and all of us, we don't operate in a vacuum. This is a naive approach. If they are well-intended, and if we are looking for solutions to the problems, and in order to see solutions in humanitarian problems, no doubt, definitely, we need political solutions. Otherwise, we will continue humanitarian assistance, which will be really fatigue on the ground, and the results day by day are getting worse. About the benefits of the people, the needs of the beneficiaries, and so on and so on. So I strongly believe that only an integrated approach, a Nexus approach, can bring such results, political oriented. Humanitarian aid remains principle, humanitarian principles framework. Development aid remains more political. Peace component is completely political, but this Nexus triple is something so necessary for me, and give me the chance, Will, to use two examples on the ground. One very painful for me, and one really good achievement and good examples. I remember during the major problem in Aleppo, in Syria, for many days, as commissioner, and also Federica and me, Mogherini, we tried a lot to provide humanitarian assistance to the people in Aleppo who were under very huge bombing and with a lot of victims, and the boys and girls are under very difficult situation. I cannot describe the situation. I tried behind the scene, and I talk even with the devil in order to find solutions and to provide assistance. Unfortunately, we didn't manage, and we saw and we experienced starvation in Aleppo because we didn't manage to overcome the obstacles, and we didn't find, maybe it was inevitable, it was impossible to find the accurate and the appropriate political way in order to provide the humanitarian assistance. This is a painful experience, and I was completely, frankly speaking, completely in favor to take political initiatives, even as humanitarian commissioner, because above all is to find solution for the needs of the people in humanitarian problem. At the same time, in Mosul, when we had the liberation of Mosul, with a very good team at that time, we prepare ourselves to provide humanitarian assistance, not only about food supply, about water, even about in education, in health, and we achieved this all together, humanitarian development actors, peace actors, and it was so beautiful. All of us there together to see the people, to welcome us, even some supporters of ISIS who were realized that this is not a solution even for them, but we saw a real reconciliation under this bomb town in Mosul in the center of the town. So even in humanitarian field, we cannot act in vacuum. We cannot act without some political components. The most important, especially the political leadership of the humanitarian action, to find the balance in this very difficult situation, to be balanced between principle framework and some political initiatives just to promote this major mission to provide assistance to the people. This is the major mission. This is why I always said that I'm ready to talk, to discuss, to negotiate with devil just to provide humanitarian assistance, just to save lives. This is our major job, save lives. This is my personal opinion. And it's also coming from my experience with a lot of painful experience, but also some achievements.
Maybe if I can expand on the examples you've given there. Do you think that, you know, those sort of situations, the situation in Aleppo, where humanitarian action can then be seen as interlinked with the political actions that you're undertaking, do you think that could potentially put humanitarian actors or reduce the space for humanitarian action or make it more dangerous for humanitarian actors?
Look, no doubt that, my dear Will, everything is okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Many times we experience on the ground that some political initiatives, if they are going beyond the critical lines, some humanitarian actors will be in a dangerous situation, no doubt. But I think it's very important to showing in every aspect of our humanitarian action that we remain neutral, impartial, independent. This is, it's a shield against everyone who wants to dismiss and to say that humanitarian actors is more or less very political. No. At the same time, with this shield around us, we can go beyond and to provide this assistance through a sort of political dialogue. In this case, definitely we need some people, some actors, some leaders of the other two communities, development and peace community. So it's a joint action. But first of all, in order to be practical and to be results oriented, we have to recognize that there is a political aspect. Otherwise, a little bit different example, but also very important. Maybe I already said this. In Ebola epidemic in Guinea, in the first phase, before I really appointed as a humanitarian, as an Ebola coordinator, some people, they killed humanitarian actors in some rural areas because they didn't accept, they didn't recognize Ebola as a disease. They believe that is a conspiracy theory against their sovereignty and so on and so on. So at that time, they were there just to make epidemiological exercise, a sort of epidemiological analysis, and they didn't engage in any political conversation. And we had some victims. So in Mosul, In Myanmar, when I visited Myanmar to support Muslim community, also at that time it was really neutral, impartial, and in some aspect, I saw that it was a political debate inside the country. So I think we can accept this small risk in order to find this balanced way to provide humanitarian assistance and to minimize the political aspect of the humanitarian aid.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I sort of put you, I think, in another provocative situation with that question. So.
Very moderator, yes.
So I only have 2 more questions left, so I would invite the students to also write their questions into the question and answer function. So my next question is, can humanitarian action push towards, continue to push towards its goal of increasing localization while also trying to link better with development actors? Is this not sort of in some way trying to move in opposite directions? Or how do you see that, humanitarians can use local capacities as a means to bridge this gap?
Once again, through my experience, I have to say that we need local NGOs, we need local actors in order to reach the vulnerable people and to help them, no doubt. And maybe you don't remember, donors committed to increase support to local actors at the World Humanitarian Forum in 2016. It was a very special commitment at that time. Due to the strict legal framework of its humanitarian funding, the European Union cannot fund directly local humanitarian actors. This is the legal framework. However, we can do so, and we do so indirectly via our established partners or via dedicated UN funds, the so-called UN country-based pooled funds. And this is indeed for the empowerment of the local actors. And I see this as a fully compatible with our development assistance. I see some of our partner organizations, such as ICRC or UNICEF, which are also operation in both humanitarian aid and development. So we have very good examples on the ground about the role of the local actors. But if we can go beyond of this balanced approach, definitely we can face, as you said, some opposite dimensions with our development actors on the ground in their development phase. So it's another necessity about our togetherness in the whole project from the beginning until the last mile of the end of this project. We need to prepare together from the first analysis until the last decision-making process. No doubt, in our action on the ground, it's difficult to avoid all these problems and obstacles. And this is the role of the practical way of thinking on the ground, because it's impossible to predict the future. It's impossible to predict every aspect of the hard reality. So this is why we need this adaptable way of thinking, to be adaptable, to adapt ourselves in order to deal with the specific problem on the ground. Sometimes cultural, sometimes other obstacles. So I think it's a very academic discussion to talk a lot about these different dimensions. No, the gap is smaller on the ground than what we believe.
So you've already given a couple of examples in one of the previous questions, but can you maybe point to a past intervention or another past intervention that you think can serve as an example of how the relationship or this gap can be bridged? You know, it was a good, a model sort of how we can do peace, development, and humanitarian action. Or do you have an intervention that you think shows a poor transition between these different actors?
Look, I already mentioned the 6 pilot countries for the EU's humanitarian development aid and the fact that this will now be very much expanded. I could also highlight that the European Union will focus also into boosting Nexus into the field of education. As I said last time, my positive obsession. This is only logical after our 10-fold increase in our support to education emergencies since 2015, and the fact that now the new EU Commissioner for International Partnership also, with her statement, wants to increase the EU's development assistance to education to 10% of the total. So we saw a sort of, with a different starting point, the same goals about education. I think this is why this goal of enhancing the humanitarian development synergies in the field of education is a recommendation at the recently adopted March 2021 new humanitarian policy framework of the European Union, and I could not agree more. So we have these very, really positive examples. No doubt that in some cases, we saw a lot of weaknesses. For example, in Libya. Also in our effort to find this nexus even in Yemen. No. In Iran. We started with humanitarian aid and we tried a lot, but because of the new political framework, we failed. Another good example, I think it's Afghanistan. We saw there a very good collaboration between humanitarian development actors, and there we acted in parallel, and we have, in addition, results on the ground because of this in parallel way from development and humanitarian perspective in a different way. So a lot of cases for study, but I strongly believe that there is a real room for improvement, especially in this nexus of triples situation. We have to focus, we have to start the discussion inside the services, but also between actors on the ground, because there is a lot of ability to go beyond as business as usual. And I think this is the new hard reality in the near future.
Thank you very much. So the first, we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first, I'll take the second one first, because I think it gets to what we were just talking about. Can you elaborate maybe a little bit more on why you think there was a failure to bridge this gap, or for development actors to come in and in Libya and Yemen? Where do you see the causes for this failure?
First of all, in both countries, the major mission is in humanitarian field, definitely. But in our attempt to see little bit a sort of infrastructure in development phase, we saw at that time with my dear colleague in DG NEAR, Johannes Hahn, that the authorities there, because of a complete lack of governance in some areas, we didn't have any interlocutor in order to connect. And this is why some of our funds, they didn't go there with the development perspective, because we didn't have even actor to provide this funding. So it's not our, I think, failure, but the situation on the ground was completely blocked, stalemate, in order to find the ways. What I consider as a failure, it's a problem for the European Union as a whole, because we didn't have, as European Union and EU institutions, the same approach in Libya, and different EU member states, they have different approaches. And it was also another obstacle, frankly speaking. We have to be sincere even with ourselves. Otherwise, we cannot deal with this problem. But it's one of our weaknesses as a European Union, as an institution with no, until now, common European external policy. We tried a lot. EAS is something very positive. The High Representative position is very positive, but in some cases, we cannot find the common position. And Libya is something very, very, I think for me, it's a really interesting case to understand even our weaknesses inside our institutions. In Yemen, the situation, when I was a commissioner, we had a lot of successful initiatives to provide humanitarian assistance, even in conflict areas. But because the situation is so complicated, the complex of the different elements of the situation, when we start to support with real infrastructure for the next day in the development phase, we failed not only European Union, but also UN agencies, USA. Of course, unfortunately, the Trump administration decided to leave and to ignore the situation. It was very bad, but okay. Sometimes, frankly speaking, the European Union is completely alone in these very huge challenges across the world. Regardless of our weaknesses, I'm very proud because I was European Commissioner, because I know also the difficulties on the ground without any responsibility from ourselves.
Thank you. So I think there are two questions now that sort of go together, so I'll read them both. Following the question about the localization agenda, how do you see the European Union supporting practically local organizations in protracted crisis settings? Many local organizations are not even capable to access the PADOR portal, and often the amount of bureaucracy from the EU makes it impossible for local organizations to officially access EU funds. How do you see a practical possible change in this regard? And then the second question is more on the legal framework around this. If you could briefly elaborate on the legal framework in place and why it does not allow for any direct funding of local actors. Would it be helpful to have such direct funding? And if so, what are the chances for adopting changes amongst the member states?
My dear friends, my dear students, this discussion about the legal framework of our humanitarian funding and the inability of EU funding directly local humanitarian actors is a very painful discussion, even inside the institutions. I cannot see now any possibility for a changing of the current legal framework for many reasons. It's a big discussions, but at the same time, what I already said about this indirectly funding via our established partners, via dedicated UN funds, the so-called UN country-based pooled funds, I think is not something, it's a very concrete way for funding, and don't underestimate it. No, and when I was commissioner, now I don't have some specific figures, but I remember many times we found ways in order to fund our partners, established partners, and dedicated UN funds, especially for these local actors. So, regardless of the obstacle of the legal framework, we found at that time solutions in order to give money to these local actors through different ways. So we need a little bit improvising, and we need very good programming every year. But I think it's not easy, and it's not helpful to enter in more details about this issue. There is a will of the DG ECHO to find ways to reach these local actors on the ground through different innovative ways.
Thank you. So I have a question myself that I would attach to one of the
always the privilege
to one of the student questions. So do you see the sort of discussions around mission creep from humanitarian actions? Do you see that as a feasible way or a good way to bridge this gap, that the humanitarian organizations go more into the development field? And along that same sort of line, do you foresee that traditionally humanitarian NGOs that rely on private donors will have to shift their marketing practices, and will there be notable ramifications for this?
Look, another practical example. I remember in Uganda, yes, in Uganda, we funded immediately at that time in a very big refugee camp from South Sudan, just to give the ability to the people there for a water, clear water. And we found ways in order to fund this project, but because we didn't cooperate with developed actors for some reasons, and because the Uganda authorities at that time were a little bit focused on their political developments in the country, it was difficult to see this very clear and very efficient cooperation. And I remember after 2-3 months, we funded another project to create infrastructure in addition money, because we didn't manage, for some reasons, we wanted, but unfortunately it was impossible to leave the people without clear water, regardless of our inability to talk with the development actors. And we spend more money and we spend more time in order to build and to create the infrastructure. So I think that this is why it's very important to start this togetherness from the analysis step by step. And in this case, we will see that many projects will be more feasible and more pragmatic and more results oriented. So this is my opinion. This is why I insist on this. At the same time, I saw a sort of competition between some humanitarian actors and development actors. Okay, it's a human habit sometimes to see this competition, even in a very difficult situation. But I think the European Union and other members of the donors community, and even the UN agencies, they can find the balanced way in order to bring together even different approach people regarding the role of the development aid and the humanitarian. We need to act on the ground. We need to act at the highest level, commissioners level, countries level, in the medium level, but also on the ground. Even another very critical example is our collaboration with our member states in their development aid in many countries. We need to increase this collaboration. And we have to know all together what is the bilateral aid from Germany, from France, from Sweden, from Denmark to some countries, where they want to go for funding. In order to see this complementarity, I think it's a very crucial word, complementarity among development actors, among different member states inside the donors community.
Thank you. We have two more questions that I see. I'm also keeping an eye on the clock because I know that we need to end by 7:30. So there's a growing tendency of incorporating social protection as a tool to bridge the humanitarian development nexus. But due to limited funding, humanitarian agencies are unable to support the social protection system at the national level and continue under multi-year programs, whereas developmental agencies are much more reluctant to engage in social protection programs. How do you think that this dilemma can be eliminated?
Look, during my mandate, we funded a lot of projects in social dimension perspective. And I remember now in Niger, in Nigeria, especially because of Boko Haram activities and so on, in Sudan, South Sudan. And that time, our collaboration with development organizations were in a very good level. Okay, sometimes the authorities they raise some obstacles because they believe that the civil society will be a little bit against some governmental activities and so on. It's a matter of our political dialogue between EU and the specific country. For example, now in Turkey, for example, I know well that despite of the decision to postpone all pre-accession funding because of some problems about rule of law and democracy, the European Union continues to support a lot of civil society organizations for women, for democratic principles, and so on. So, in many countries, the European Union remains the most important ally for the civil societies organizations. And even inside the European Union, I know well many, and myself, against some initiatives from Prime Minister Orban in Hungary. Also the problem of rule of law in Poland. So nobody is perfect, but I strongly believe that the European Union is a sort of oasis regarding rule of law and democracy, and support civil society in their activities to increase the democratic level in their countries. Of course, there is a gap, there is a real room for improvements, but sometimes we have to be realistic about the ability of one factor at the international level, European Union, about the so difficult to make the difference completely alone. And I realized this as commissioner when we lost Obama administration and we had a Trump administration in a completely different way of thinking. And immediately we realized ourselves to be completely alone at this very huge problematic international landscape. So we have to be a little bit pragmatic about our ability to change the world. We need to insist on this, but also to recognize our positive steps, to recognize our weaknesses, but it's very important to recognize our efforts for this in this dimension. It's very important because the European citizens, they need this recognition because they pay a lot in our European funding, in our European budget. And I saw this in many areas through the citizens' dialogue that the European people, the European citizens, they were against in some initiatives and proposals from far-right wing parties to stop humanitarian aid, even development, and so on and so on. So the majority of the people in Europe, the European citizens, remain completely as in alliance to continue our humanitarian assistance and development in other continents. So I'm very proud of these European citizens.
So I think our last question for now is, what do you think about the proposition from Thea Hilhorst of moving from principled humanitarian action to a more human rights approach?
In similar cases, dear Will, do you believe that the distinction is so clear? My question.
I would have to give that to the audience member who asked that.
And if I remember in the Democratic Republic of Congo when we dealt with the last Ebola outbreak, and we had in some areas a lot of conflicts and security issues just to provide health assistance, just to provide the vaccines, medicines. And at that time, we identified that the human rights problem, the security problem, and the humanitarian problems are more or less in the same basket. So who can separate this baggage, and where is the distinction in order to ignore the one aspect and to focus on the other? So, frankly speaking, on the ground, with practical way of thinking, sometimes it's less complicated than when we think from distance. I think now the European Union decision, I think it's so necessary, and I can support it.
Thank you very much. I think that's the end of our questions. I'll maybe leave it open for another couple of seconds in case anyone has a follow-up to any of those points.
Just to say again, thanks for your attention, and definitely in my next trip to Bochum, or we can meet each other in order to talk a lot in person, and maybe it's a more human environment to talk these really very dilemmas and very difficult questions, because sometimes the answers are not so easy as we believe. Yes. And this is the challenge for the humanitarian actors, and also this in this field, in these communities.
I would very much look forward to that. As much as, you know, the beauty of online webinars has been that you can sit in Athens and I can sit in Essen and we can have these sort of conversations.
In Essen, definitely.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So just as a quick note, our next event won't be next week, but will be the week after. So I believe on the 7th of July.
7th of July, yes.
So there will be a link that will go out to everyone. I would like to thank all of the participants. I would like to especially thank the commissioner and all of the students and alumni who were listening today, and especially for all of the excellent questions that you submitted. And yes, I look forward to our next conversation sometime soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Have a good day. Bye.